All right. Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Frederick Weisel in conversation with Joseph Schneider. Excuse me. My name is Jamie Madsen and I will be your host for the evening. And I just have a couple items to note before we dive in. The format tonight will feature between 40 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. For any questions or comments that you have tonight for the speakers, go ahead and submit them under the Q&A icon, which is right in the bottom of your screen. So it makes it very easy for the speakers to see them. Additionally, go ahead and keep one eye on your chat box. I will be using it to share discount codes, links for tonight's title, pre-ordering titles, and other goodies. So now I'm really thrilled to introduce tonight's author. Frederick Weisel has been a writer and editor for more than 30 years. He graduated from Antioch College and has an MA in Victorian Literature and History from the University of Leicester in England. Frederick is currently at work on the third novel in the VCI series and lives with his wife in Santa Rosa. And in conversation with Fred tonight is the author of One Day You'll Burn and What Waits for You, Joseph Schneider. He is an acclaimed author, magician, ballroom dancer, and teacher, and lives in California with his family. Now, they're with us tonight to discuss the second book in the VCI series that just came out today called The Day He Left. And we couldn't be happier to have you on Pub Night, Fred. So why don't you get us started?
Okay. Well, thank you, Jamie. And I'd like to thank Copperfield's Books for hosting this event and giving me this opportunity. I'm very grateful for that. And if you haven't already bought your book, I hope you'll buy it from Copperfield's. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm very happy that you're joining us tonight. And I'm especially like to thank those of you on the East Coast who are staying up late tonight. And I'd like to thank Joseph for joining me in this conversation. Joseph and I share an editor and publisher. Joseph's novels feature an academically trained detective, and if you haven't already read them, I highly recommend them. Here's one of his right here. Tonight we're going to talk for half an hour or so about how I came to write the book, my writing process, the characters, the style, some other aspects of the book. And then, as Jamie said, we'll turn it over for Q&A. So if you have any questions, put them there. I'll just say a couple words about The Day He Left. It's the second novel in my series. It follows The Silenced Women, which came out a year ago. And it follows the same 5 detectives as that first book, but it's a different kind of case. It's a missing persons case. And you don't have to have read the first book in order to read the second. But for tonight, I'll assume that most of you have not read the second book, and so I'll try not to give anything away. With that, I'll turn it over to Joseph, and let's get into it.
Thank you so much, Fred. And I'm very grateful that you decided to have me on board with you tonight. It means a lot to me.
Sure.
And I'm glad you said that last part, actually, because that reminds me not to give any spoilers away. And hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. So if I could start off, Fred, by asking what the genesis of the idea was. What was that initial spark for The Day He Left?
So the initial idea came from, I read a short article in our local newspaper, the Press Democrat, and it was an article about a school teacher who disappeared. And it made me think about why he disappeared and where he went. And it was, in real life, that school teacher was eventually found safe and everything was fine. But it started me thinking. And what I've learned over the years is that in our local newspaper, there are often these short articles. They're just 3 or 4 paragraphs. And it's at a time when the reporters don't know very much. It's a breaking story. and their sources don't know very much. And so for the newspaper, it's not the whole story, but for me, it's like the first page of a story. And so I get a lot of my ideas that way. And so the premise for the story is that a school teacher leaves his home one morning and is going to go to the school, but he never arrives. And so he's married, he has 2 kids, he's a very well-respected teacher, he's loved by his students. And when he leaves, his family doesn't know where he is, his wife doesn't know where he is, the school doesn't know where he is. And he leaves behind his phone, his lesson plans, and a kind of disturbing photograph. So that's where the story starts. I'm not giving anything away. That all happens in the first 3 or 4 pages, but that's kind of the premise for it. And then the other starting point for me was after the first book, I wanted to write about a different kind of crime. I wanted to write about missing persons. I've always been kind of intrigued by that kind of thing that happens. And I also wanted to talk about the family of the victim. I've noticed that when you read crime stories or you see something on TV, the investigation starts with a victim, but then it very quickly involves the children and the wife and the parents and the siblings. And I wanted to look at all that. So that's kind of where the genesis, as you said, that's where all this started.
Well, that's interesting because in reading it, I was struck by that. My first question, of course, was where could the teacher have gone in the time between leaving the house and getting to school? What possibly could have happened? Yeah. Which I think is a wonderful thing to do for a reader, is get them to start asking questions like that right out the gate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was writing this one different than the first one in the sense that you had something else you wanted to accomplish or achieve?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll see if you agree with this, but I think that writing a series is different from writing standalone novels because the readers have some expectation of you. And so the first novel in a series introduces these recurring characters and it establishes the style and the voice. And I think people who like series, they like those recurring characters. They want them to come back. And so in the second book, you have to bring them back. I mean, you have to bring your detective back and the people who work around him. But I also think it's more interesting if they're changing from the second book after the first book, and you show them changing and evolving. And in this book, the detective Eddie Mahler is in therapy after all the trauma he's been through. So yeah, I was trying to sort of keep the same main players, but do something different with them. And I won't spoil any more, but those same 5 detectives come back with different things happening, different things going on.
Well, since you brought it up, that was actually something I found very interesting as well, that your lead detective is in therapy. What made you decide to do that?
I found out that police officers have they have to do mandatory therapy. If something happens, if there's some, if there's a shooting or something like that, they have to do that. And I wanted to extend that and have him go into therapy to try to confront his own demons. And I liked the whole therapeutic process as a way of people confronting things in their life. And the way it came about in the book was actually an accident. I thought I wanted to do these therapy sessions. And so in my notes, I wrote down a series of like a dialogue, just like a play where the therapist says something, the Mahler says something, and that's all that it is. And I put them in my notes. And at a certain point, I just copied and pasted them into the draft. And I thought that'll be a placeholder. I'll figure this out later. But as I read successive drafts, I thought it's fine, just leave it that way, because what's happening is in the present tense, Mahler's talking to somebody.
Right.
And in his mind, he remembers a little bit of the therapy session. And so I thought, just leave it that way. And I hope it works. I thought it was just an interesting way to break up the story.
Yeah, I thought I really enjoyed that from a formatting perspective. I thought that was a really neat idea to do it that way.
Oh, good.
Because otherwise you run the risk of kind of impeding on the action instead of commenting on it, which I thought was a really neat way to go about it.
Oh, good.
And I noticed that you have your character, Eden Summers, is also, she's tormented as well by experiences that she's had, and those seemed very authentic. And I was just curious if you talked to a law enforcement officer or agent who shared with you some of the ways that those terrible cases can stick with you. Because
actually, I have interviewed a retired police lieutenant, but both Eddie and Eden, that whole experience was just invented. I didn't hear that from anyone. I did have it confirmed later by several officers who read it and said, yeah, that sounds right. So I felt good about that, but I didn't do that ahead of time.
So were any of the characters in your novel based on real people, or were they invented from whole cloth, so to speak?
So none of them are based on real people. They're all kind of a blend of people I've known, kind of a mixture of people I've known. I tend to what Eden Summers is like a mixture of several young women I've known. I tend to like pick out parts of different people I've known to create a character. And I'll tell an interesting story is that I took this class with a local police department called the Citizens Police Academy. It was an 8-week class, and it was very intense. I learned a lot about practices and procedures. And at the time I took the class, I had already written the first book and was about halfway through the second. And one night after the class, I went up and I talked to this young homicide detective, a VCI detective, and he was a military veteran. And I was asking him questions and he was answering the questions. And then at a certain point, I don't know if you can tell this sometimes, but you're talking to someone and you could just see he was getting less and less interested in talking to me. And I had this very strange experience. I suddenly realized that this detective I was talking to was exactly like my character, Steve Frames. And it was like the flip side of basing a character on a real person. It was a real person who was my character. And I almost thought that he was going to start saying some of the sarcastic things that my character said. And I'm wondering, maybe in a future novel, I might have Steve Frames meet a mystery novelist and start talking to him and just see what happens.
That's great. Do you mind if I ask you a couple kind of shop questions as far as
Sure.
as far as process goes?
Sure.
Because I'm always interested in what other folks are doing out there. Are you a pantser or an outliner? What do you like to do?
So I do have an outline. in the beginning, it's very rough. I always have 3 acts or 3 parts. And at the beginning, I know what's in each of those. But other than that, I don't. But I think, actually, I heard you say this in an interview a while back, that as you have written these, you're trying to get more efficient and not throw things away, write things that you have to end up throwing away. And so as I've written these, I've tried to get more efficient. And as I go along, I make an outline and it becomes more detailed, so that when I'm probably 3/4 of the way through, or less than that, probably halfway through, I have an idea of everything else that's going to follow. I don't know the ending at the beginning, but I do know it fairly soon after that. And I think that's important because you want to do that foreshadowing and, drop the breadcrumbs to help people know where you're going. And so I do know the ending. So how about you? Do you have an outline, or are you just off the seat of your pants?
No, I know that if I don't outline, I'm gonna get 10 pages in, and then I'm gonna get very discouraged because I don't know what I'm doing. So
Yeah.
I have to, but, and I believe me, I don't like doing it. I feel like I want to get to the fun stuff, but
Yeah.
so, so other than the Citizens Academy, and I've done what county did you do that in?
So this is a Santa Rosa Police Department.
Oh, Santa Rosa PD.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I have to say it was an excellent class. My wife and I both took it, and I was expecting it would be very informal, just kind of a chat, but they did very detailed presentations, 2 or 3 each night, and then they had 2 all-day sessions at their training center. So it was very worthwhile.
I completely agree. In fact, I would say it was kind of critical for my process as well, because like you, I don't come from a law enforcement background, so it was definitely something without which I think would have been a real struggle. In addition to that, what was your research process?
So I do a lot, and I do a lot of just Google searches. If I don't understand something, or it's an area I've never thought about before, I do a Google search. For this particular book, I read a book called Missing Persons Investigations, Guidelines, and Curriculum, and that was like a law enforcement textbook. And that taught me a lot. I was really glad I was able to read it. I learned, for instance, that most missing persons are found, despite what we might think, because we hear about the larger cases where the person isn't found. And if you watch a lot of cop shows, you'll hear the detectives say, well, we have to wait 24 hours to make sure the person is really missing. And that's not true. Especially with children and the elderly, they want to start looking right away. I did a lot of research for this book on narcotics, on fentanyl, on automobile accident investigations, and on the curriculum in a middle school. I wanted to make sure I had at least some rough idea of what I was talking about. And I'll tell one story, is that without giving too much away, there's a part of this novel where the detective Eden Summers is working on this old FBI case. And one of the pieces of evidence is a cotton sheet. And I thought I should figure out how to make this a piece of evidence. So I went online and I found a website from a trade organization called Cotton Incorporated in North Carolina. And that website had literally hundreds of photographs of the defects in the weaving process of cotton. And each one was distinct. So I studied that for a couple hours. I picked out one defect, and then I went to the contact section of that website and I sent an email and I said, I'm writing a mystery novel. and I'm looking for a defect in cotton, and I picked this one. Do you think this meets my criteria? And I thought, well, they'll think this is a crazy thing and they won't write back. But I sent the email at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And at 9 o'clock Friday night, I got an email back, and it was the vice president of Cotton Incorporated. And she was forwarding my email to the senior director of product development. The first sentence was, "This has to be the best question ever submitted online." And Monday morning, the senior director wrote me a long email, several pages, all about defects in cotton. And so it was perfect. And it was like a lesson to me that not to be afraid to ask people, that sometimes they'll think you're crazy, but other times, if a lot of people are interested in their own work. And so, they're happy to talk to you. I have mixed feelings about research. I think it's very important that it provides the detail that makes our books believable, and that the more detail you have, the more believable the book is, the more authentic it sounds. But I also think that there's a place for invention, and that when I started this series, I didn't do any research on the local police department. And I invented 5 detectives, 5 homicide detectives. And it wasn't until I was nearly finished the first book that I found out that the local police department actually has a team of 5 homicide detectives. And so I invented that before I knew it was there. And I felt shy about that for a long time. And then lately, I read this mystery writer named Tana French. And she has this group called the Dublin Murder Squad, and she just made that up. That doesn't exist. And then I love this British series called Vera. And Vera has something called the Northumberland and City Police, and that doesn't exist. The author just made that up. And so I think, research is really helpful to get the detail, but I think we also have to be willing just to create things and trust our own invention.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. I know exactly what you mean. Well, we have 2 wonderful questions in the Q&A. The first comes from Chelsea. Fred, do you feel like your writing has changed throughout the series? If so, how?
That's a good question. Yes. I'm trying to learn. Well, I'm trying to learn how to do this in general. I mean, I didn't do an MFA. I didn't take a class. So I'm trying to teach myself how to do this. And I think I've learned how to do more character work and write these interior monologues so I can describe how people are thinking and adding that to the story. They aren't often used in mysteries, but I really like writing them. And I think as I've gone along, I've learned how to do that. I belong to a writers group of, there's 3 other mystery writers, and we get together every couple of weeks and read each other's stuff. And over the years, I've learned a lot from them about how to do this. And so I think I'm learning how to put more effort into the character part of the story, and that's the biggest change that's happened.
Excellent. And this one from Caitlin. Do you know how many books you plan in the series? That is, do you know the longer story arc for your characters?
I do not. I'm working on a 3rd one now, but I don't have an overall plan. I'd like to, write them as long as I can, and I like to keep most of the team, and I'm sure I'll expand the team. One of the guys is retiring, and he's probably going to be leaving the books. But other than that, I honestly don't know.
And this question from Marie, what do you enjoy most about writing this series?
A really simple answer, it's fun. I mean, I don't know how you feel, Joseph, but I just feel like writing these kinds of stories is fun. I mean, I like writing action.
Do you mean crime stories in particular?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I like, it's kind of a puzzle of figuring out what to include, when to include it, how to withhold information, when to leak it out. And in mysteries, there's a secret, secrets, there's lots of secrets. And I think we read mysteries in a different way than we read other fiction, because we're trying to figure out who did it, and we read them in a different way. And I think we write them in a different way. I'm actually, if I should admit this, but I'm not interested in the whodunit part. I'm interested in how the story evolves and what happens to the characters through the course of the story. And mysteries are like, peeling back layers of an onion. And I like that part of it. I don't necessarily care about the whodunit part. Agatha Christie did that so well, and I'll never do it as well as she did. So that's not as much.
And this question comes from John. What sort of people do you see as your audience?
Wow.
I don't know. That's a tough one.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Can I add to that a little bit? Because I had this question as well. One of the reviews called The Day He Left a mix of literature and mystery or crime fiction. And so I guess your question would have to, I guess the question more broadly also addresses, like, do you have an ideal audience in your head that you're writing to, like a specific person in a way that you direct all of your work towards, or do you have a more of a general idea of an audience?
Yeah, I really don't. I guess one thing I learned when the first book came out is a lot of my family and friends said, well, Fred, this is interesting. If you hadn't written it, I wouldn't have read it, because I don't read mysteries. And I get that. They're not everybody's cup of tea. But what I've tried to do to address the part of that you added to the question is I've tried to add more literary elements to the book, metaphor and interior monologue. So my audience can be people who are used to reading literary novels, not mysteries, because there's a lot of literary aspects in there. It's not, in fact, I get criticized online because it's not a strict mystery. I mean, I throw in all kinds of stuff that's not normally in a mystery. Another way to answer it is I like to tell a story, and I hope that these are good stories, and the emphasis is on the story. And I hope if you enjoy hearing stories that you would like these.
I'm glad you answered that in that way, because I think that's a very fair answer, and I sympathize with you when it comes to trying to create something that's going to please a hardcore mystery fan, and at the same time try to do something that's more personal and a little different. I think that's marvelous. We have a question here. Do you mind if I throw out some more questions from the Q&A? Okay,
perfect, sure.
So Elizabeth asks that you mentioned you have 3 acts in mind when starting a novel. I'm wondering if there are any other structures or substructures that you have in mind when writing.
No, I do. am aware of pace, and I would say of all the parts of writing a novel, that's the hardest for me, is the pace. And interestingly, the reviews for this latest novel have been on both sides of the spectrum. Several people have written, they told me the pace is just wonderful. And then I got a review the other day that said, this is a great novel except for its pace, which is too slow. And that actually comes back to the last question, which I think if you're a hardcore mystery fan, you just want the action, you want to get to the end and find out who it is. But in terms of other structures, I try to write short chapters. I think that keeps the book moving. And when I wrote the first book, I had this problem where I had 5 detectives all working on a case, and I wanted to show them working independently at various times. And I didn't want to bother to write the narrative connection between each one. So I divided each chapter into 2 scenes, and the scenes just happen. You know, it's like, here's a scene, here's a scene, here's a scene, and it doesn't get you from one to the next. And after I wrote the first book, I liked that. And I've gotten criticized for that because people feel it's very dispersed, but I think it keeps the action moving. Is it like you have a scene with Eden, and that scene is unresolved, and so you want to read on to find out what happened to Eden, but then the next scene is with Eddie, and that scene is unresolved. So it keeps you, you know, it kind of propels you through the book, and that's the idea behind it. It's sort of a plus and a minus, you know, in some ways, but that's the only other structure I have in mind.
That's interesting. I know exactly what you mean about not wanting to tie up each chapter with a nice bow on it, because then you provide a certain relief, and you don't want to provide relief.
No, I saw an interview a couple years ago, the novelist Jonathan Franzen, and he said the greatest danger for any novel is the reader can stop reading. And I'm sure you've noticed this. If you go on Amazon, you'll see a review and it'll say DNF, which means did not finish, which is like walking out in the middle of a movie. So you're right. You don't want to have the chapter be too resolved, because then the person can just close the book, and you don't want them to close the book. So.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. No, I can these 2 questions are in a way kind of similar. In writing about places that you've, the places you include in your book, Santa Rosa, in San Francisco, Susan was curious about why you picked a particular restaurant. Is Perbaco, is that the correct pronunciation? Why you picked, and are you inspired by places other than Santa Rosa, or is there something specific about that place?
Okay, so
or so more broadly, how do you pick your settings?
So I decided when I wrote the first book that I would use the real names of places. That I know there's a tradition in mysteries where you make up a town and you make up, you know, the area, and I think that was done more in the past. And now writers, you know, Michael Connelly and you, Joseph, we use the real names, and so I like doing that. In the first book, I asked my editor, Barbara Peters, I'm sure you know, if I could use the names of real restaurants. And she said, sure, they'll probably be happy. And I ate dinner at one time at Perbaco's, and so I used that name. They never said anything, so I guess it's fine. And I like using the real names of Sonoma County because there haven't been many books written up here. As far as I know, very few mysteries. And so I like using the real names and giving people a way to visualize the scene. So if I say it's on Chalk Hill Road, people who live here know where that is and know exactly what it looks like. So I like using those real places.
Totally. Wow, a lot of really terrific questions coming in. Why did you have the detectives largely working apart in this book as opposed to in the previous book where they were a more cohesive unit?
I didn't intentionally do that.
Mhm.
I wasn't aware that I had done it. And I think in this book, there's a little bit more separated because there's the missing persons case, there's the narcotics case, and then there's Eden is working on the FBI case. And so I didn't intentionally do that, but it probably did separate them unintentionally. I do like them to be working together at some point, and they come in and they talk to each other and interact, but they also go out on their own. And this retired police lieutenant that I interviewed, he told me that they're always busy. They're always working on 8 or 10 cases. It's never, they never have, time on their hands. So there's always something going on.
There's always something. Yep. Now this question comes in from Karina. How do you balance in terms of planning, dropping hints and clues and having the ending be more of a surprise? Do you want the reader to figure it out? Answers may vary from book 1 to 2, she says.
Yeah, and that's one of the hardest things for me to do. I keep as I said, I keep a detailed outline. I do a lot of rewriting. Usually, if it takes me a year to write the book, I'll take another year to rewrite it. And I look at all those places where information is put in and withheld. And even in the editing process, working with Anna, she's helped me see where I needed to let people know more. It is a challenging thing. It's and for me, that part of it doesn't come naturally. The dialogue and the characterization comes very naturally to me. The more mechanical part of the clues, that's a harder thing. I have to really think about it, and sometimes even make like a map of it, and show where the information is.
I think you did a terrific job threading in clues and not giving it away, but giving enough so that at the end it felt fair. I thought that was really well done.
Oh, thank you.
Because I think that's I find that very challenging to do, and I usually bungle it. So I'm always impressed when when I meet somebody who pulls it off. What else did I want to ask you? Now, since you're, VCI, you have men and women. Do you find it more challenging to write male or female characters, or does it not really matter?
No, I honestly find them both hard to write. And I guess there's no difference for me. I would leave it up to readers to tell me if the males or the females are more believable, one or the other. I will say that Eden Summers is the most fun for me to write. I always look forward to those scenes, and she's a smart young woman in a male-dominated culture, and I'm just grateful that she came to me as a character. I guess the other thing I would say is for all the characters, I try to find something unique in each one so that they come alive for the reader. And so, each one is different from the other. And when you think about frames, or when you think about Coil, you think of them as different people.
Wonderful. Along those lines, about what makes them different, but what also unifies them in this book, I think, in many ways is the sense of a past rooted in something to do with their families. Of course, the book deals with two main families, but then the detectives individually also have memories of their mothers and fathers. Was making the book about one's relationship to one's family, was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, it definitely was. When I decided to write the missing person part, I really thought about wanting to talk about the wife and the children and the siblings. And I wanted to show kind of how families work, the dysfunctions of families, the secrets within families. The part about the families of the detectives was an accident. And the way it came about was, I thought, as I imagined them interviewing various members of the family, each detective is doing it by himself or herself. And when they're asking questions, I thought, what would they be thinking about when they're asking the questions? And it just naturally, I thought, if they're interviewing a 13-year-old girl, they might think about, what it was like when they were that young. And they might think about their mothers and their fathers. And so I started writing that interior monologue, that thought process. And then I discovered, I think after I'd written the whole first draft, that there was a lot about family in there, in the detectives' scenes. And I thought, well, that's good. And in a series, you want to help your readers to find out more and more about these recurring characters. And so now, after the second book, you know more about Eden's mother and father. You know a lot about Eddie's father and mother, and some of the others, they talk about their parents. And I think that makes those characters more authentic, more three-dimensional, that you know about their families, their backgrounds, their past, and not just the law enforcement part of their lives. There's a scene late in the second novel where Eden is talking to this young 13-year-old girl, and she remembers her mother. Eden remembers her mother telling her a family secret. And it's just a couple paragraphs, but that's, I think, one of the things I'm proudest of in the book. It's just sort of a crystallization of who Eden is, who her mother was. It's this very traditional New England family where they had rules about what you revealed to each other, and that's there in that memory. So yeah. Anyway.
Do you mind if I ask you something that's just kind of occurred to me when you were speaking just now? But do you find any of this process cathartic in a personal way at all when you write? Do you find that you ever exercise any demons doing this sort of work?
Boy, I hadn't thought of that before. I'm not sure. In some ways I do. I've been thinking a lot about fear lately, and I have all kinds of fears. I have fears of the dark. I'm very afraid of handguns, and so writing about them in the story, there's a scene in the first book where two of the detectives are in a dark park, and I don't know if it was cathartic, but I was able to very carefully describe the fear that they're going through. And so maybe I'm using the demons that I have and writing about them. I hadn't thought about that before. But yeah.
I was just curious because sometimes, I wonder why I get involved with this material. It's just pretty unpleasant. Some of it can be pretty unpleasant. I don't know if you've had the experience of being a little rattled by some research that you've done.
Yeah.
It's maybe stuck with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really it's hard. It's hard to you know, often you wish you didn't know certain things, like, oh wow, I could have gone through my whole life without having read that particular case.
Yeah. And I
And
think,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just curious if that had also been your experience.
Yeah, and it does, doing the research does give me more of an idea about what these law enforcement officers go through and what they see in the course of their work. And it's not a kind of work I could do. I mean, I can write about it and put it aside, and they can't. And I'm not, it's not in my face the way it is for them.
Thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to answer these questions. I wasn't sure if Jamie wanted to take over at this point. I believe she mentioned a certain time. Hello, Jamie.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I was just enjoying this conversation. It's been really wonderful hearing you guys talk. So thank you. Just real quick, I'm gonna wrap it up. We are recording this. So tomorrow, if all you did tonight is watch, it's okay. You will get an email and it'll have a link to the recording. It'll have the discount code. It'll have tonight's title. It'll have a pre-order link for Joseph's title. It will have everything you need. So on that note, I'm thrilled to have had you both here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful to you again, Fred, for having me on, and my heartiest congratulations to you for this achievement.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Great. Well, I hope you all have a nice night. And Fred, I hope to have you back for the third installment.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Okay.
Thanks, Jamie. All right.
Have a marvelous night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.